Check Podcasts.
Hi, I'm Bruce Williams. I'm the CEO of the Greater Victoria Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to Chamber Chats, coming to you as always from the podcasting studios here at the Czech Media Group, one of our chamber champions. You're going to meet another champion in just a second. I want to acknowledge, as always, that we live and work in the ancestral unceded territory and the lands of the Lekwungen-speaking nations, known to us as Songhees and Esquimalt, or Kosapsum. And all of this is made possible by the support of Island Savings, a division of First West Credit Union, who are redefining what banking can do for people, for community, and for the world. One of the greatest things that's happened for years and years in Greater Victoria was Scotiabank Hockey Day in Canada. Remember that back in January? An amazing day seen across the country. Victoria is known as a sports town. Victoria and Greater Victoria is actually a huge hockey town, as we proved with the support that we showed for Scotiabank Hockey Day in Canada. Today, one of our chamber champions joins us because this is a book that she has written. Her name is Helen Edwards, and she is the author of The History of Professional Hockey in Victoria going back to 1911, Helen.
Yes.
Wowie. This book, we're going to talk about a bunch of people and stuff in the book. You spent 7 years putting this together. Tell me about that.
Well, when the Victoria Salmon Kings were disbanded, I was upset because I love pro hockey.
Mm-hmm.
And about the same time, Bill Schvatz, who'd played for the Victoria Maple Leafs in the 60s, died. And it was just sort of the two coming together. I've got to tell the story. Because if I don't tell the stories, nobody will ever hear them and the stories will die. And then I spent, 7 years, most of it reading microfilm, which is very hard on the eyes.
Yes.
But I got the story, and it's amazing what you find when you dig. And I just wanted to bring those stories to life. And I know one fellow I interviewed, he said, I never thought anybody would ever tell my story because he was a minor leaguer.
Mm-hmm.
He said, but you have. And for that, I thank you. So
where did all that stuff live that you went through the microfilm? Where did you go to find that?
I went to the public library. I practically lived there. And then I discovered that UVic had it. And in later years, UVic had it digitized. It still wasn't searchable, but it was digitized. So I could transfer it and take it home on a stick.
Mm-hmm.
But at the library, I had to print everything off. So it was a little expensive, too, now that I think about it.
Yeah, no kidding.
And now, of course, I can just go online and it's done. It's done.
So you're looking through, is it old newspaper things?
Old
and
newspapers.
Mostly, yeah.
Yeah. And I did go to the BC archives. They have quite a few things. They had some sound recordings. They have some artifacts. They didn't have as much as I thought they would. And the BC Sports Hall of Fame in Vancouver were fabulous. Jason there does a marvelous job. And they were able to get me some photographs that I couldn't get anywhere else. So I look on it as a team effort.
Well, it's a team sport, too.
Exactly.
We are soon going to be celebrating the 100th anniversary of Victoria winning the Stanley Cup, which we're going to talk about in just a second. But let's go back to these early days.
Yeah.
If there was one person who would get the credit for making hockey a thing in Victoria, who would that be?
Joe Patrick.
Okay, and tell me about Joe.
Okay, Joe was a lumberman in Quebec, moved out to Nelson, BC, and of course brought his family with him. And the ones that we remember the most are Lester Patrick and Frank Patrick. And Frank had a dream of starting a pro hockey league in British Columbia. Now, of course, the problem here is we can't skate in the winter outside because we don't get the cold weather. So they had to think about that. But it was Frank's wish, and Joe sold his business, moved to Victoria, and eventually became an alderman. So he was very active in the community as well. But it was his money. Lester handled things in Victoria, and Frank was handling things in Vancouver.
Okay. Lester Patrick I want to talk about because he, again, is maybe, with all due respect to the others, maybe the best known name, maybe the most famous of all of these people?
Oh, most likely, yes, because he went on to fame in the NHL as well.
Yeah,
so
in New York.
In New York as a coach. And I think what people don't give Frank enough credit.
Okay.
But the two of them really changed the game of hockey because they set up rules that everybody thought were crazy at the time, and now most of them are incorporated into the NHL rules. So, before they were around, there was no changing on the fly.
Oh, you had to stop play, stop a whistle.
If you even changed, because in the early days, the guys played 60 minutes.
Oh, yeah.
So there was, very few. And later they did substitutions, but they waited till the play stopped.
And there was more players on the ice, too, at the same time, right?
Yeah, there were 7 in
Yeah.
the beginning. There was an additional player called a rover,
Okay.
who sort of was another defenseman.
On the same size ice surface.
Yeah,
So
same
you
size
try to
ice
imagine
surface.
that now with how fast these guys are moving.
Well, they weren't that fast in those days.
Yeah.
Most of them were farmers.
Yeah.
And that's how they kept in shape, is, doing the farming the rest of the year. And they would come to camp and they wouldn't be in shape. Not like now where the guys train year round.
Yeah. So in the early days when these rinks and things were being built, we're going to talk about those series. The Patrick name appeared on one of the rinks.
Yes,
Tell
it
me
did.
about the arena. Tell me about that.
Okay, that was in Oak Bay. It's pretty well across from where Oak Bay High School is now. There's now an apartment block because it was built and then it burned down.
Well, that happened a couple of times, right?
Yes, there were 2 arenas on that site. The second one was the conversion of an agricultural barn by Barney Olson from Strathcona Hotel. And they didn't play pro hockey there, but they did play a lot of hockey. And then it burnt down too. And then there was a long time before they built the Memorial Arena. And if you want to read a story about politics and how to not build an arena,
Oh, man.
you read that story.
So Lester Patrick tried to move this forward as a sporting thing, as a league thing, as a business venture.
Yeah.
It wasn't easy. It was not easy for him at all, was it?
No, it was not easy. They encountered immense difficulties. And of course, there were the powerful owners in the East. And they thought that the Patricks were trying to steal their players.
And they did steal some.
Well, sure they did. They raided them. The only team they didn't raid was Ottawa. Now, why? I don't know. But that's how some of the players ended up out here. And, eventually they made peace. But it was nasty for a while there.
Yeah. So when you talk about going back and doing that research you did through the microfilm and all
Yeah.
that sort of thing, in the early days of it being reported, it wasn't thoroughly reported. It wasn't well reported. Like they would say the name of a team only by its city. They wouldn't use the name of the
Oh,
team.
yeah. There were no official nicknames. So they'd call them Lester's Puck Chasers. Or,
Say that 3 times fast.
yeah, I know. And the Victorias. And Vancouver was called the Terminals. But New Westminster was always called the Royals. I mean, just figure that one out.
Wow.
But it didn't, and then one newspaper would use one name and the other would use the other. And it wasn't really until 1922, after a competition, that the name Victoria Cougars was born. And that became the official name.
Okay, we're going to talk about some other people. We're going to name drop in just a second when we talk more about this book called The History of Professional Hockey in Victoria, BC. That's coming up next. Our guest on Chamber Chats today is Helen Edwards, the author of this book, The History of Professional Hockey in Victoria, BC. The name that stands out for me, as you and I were talking about earlier, is a guy named Hap Holmes, or Happy Holmes.
Happy Holmes.
Happy Holmes is one of those guys that came from the East because he grew up in the same town I did in Ontario. Different time, granted.
Yeah.
And as I've looked him up, he lived in a house around the corner from the house that I grew up in.
Wow.
But tell me about Hap Holmes. He's a Hall of Fame guy, and he won the Cup 4 times.
Yeah, and he's a goaltender. And he always wore a crazy hat.
And there was a reason for that, right? Because he had a bald head,
He did.
and he didn't want to be a target for people throwing things at him.
Exactly. Because people could be really nasty in those days. Well, I guess they still are, but now we have security in rinks. Yeah, but he was a fabulous goaltender and led us to wonderful things.
Yeah. Now, I want to talk about the equipment. We'll come back to the people in a second, but the equipment that is worn today obviously is very much protective because these are multi-million-dollar athletes. Back
That's
then,
right.
they didn't even wear helmets back then.
No, they didn't wear helmets. Goaltending equipment was pretty sparse.
I think a lot of them held the goalie stick with 2 hands, right?
Yeah.
Because they didn't have a glove hand.
No gloves. No protection.
Anywhere?
Oh, I don't know.
Well, not like today.
Not like today. I mean, they're very well protected today, but they might. There are stories of people wearing magazines under their pants to protect their legs. So, it's not. It was basically guys just getting together and skating around.
Yeah, but even the skates back then wouldn't
Oh,
have been. Like,
they were pretty primitive too. And they weren't all custom fit and all this stuff. No, and there was certainly no protection for your arms, your hands.
yeah.
Um,
There was a guy named Tommy Dunderdahl. Tell me about him.
oh, here's a fabulous story. He's born in Australia, but his parents moved to Winnipeg. And so he grew up playing hockey, and he was possibly the biggest signing that the team had in the early days. And he just set the league on fire with his scoring. And he has ended up in the Hall of Fame. The only irony is you can't find him after he leaves hockey. He just disappears from public records.
Don't even know if he stayed around here, right?
Well, he went back to Winnipeg. We know
Okay.
that.
Yeah.
Because he's in the Manitoba Hall of Fame. But where he died, what happened to his wife, we don't know.
Jack Ulrich.
Also called Silent. He was a deaf mute.
Yeah.
And he's one of about 3 or 4 to play in the game. And he only lasted 1 season, but he made an impact. And I honestly don't know how they communicated. They must have done signs or something, but he was able to play and keep up with the rest of them. And just to think that he couldn't hear, and so much of sports is communication, and he couldn't hear. So,
Yeah, I mean, you think about those times back then. We were not embracive and inclusive of people like him.
oh Lord, no.
But here it was
No.
a case. They brought him in and he played.
He did. And that's one thing about Lester Patrick. He didn't care your race, your creed,
Nothing.
how you were built, whatever. If you could play hockey, you were here.
Yeah. That's why he's such a great pioneer. Frank Foyston.
Yeah. He came from Seattle,
Okay.
and he was an amazing forward. And just, when you consider that these guys played the whole game pretty well.
Yeah.
In the later years, substitutions occasionally, but basically, if you were the star player, you were on the ice for almost the whole game.
For 60 minutes. Yeah.
60 minutes.
What was the penalty structure like back then? Or was it just kind of a free-for-all?
Yeah, there were a number of rules, and there was none of this. After the penalty's over, the guy comes out. Not in the early days. Frank made a lot of changes to the penalty system, but they've made many more since then. It was just essentially you were a man down, and then of course you didn't have somebody to. If the play was still going on, the guy couldn't come out of the box, so you could be down for 3 minutes or 4 minutes. It's just
it's a whole different game. Between the
yeah.
gear and the rules and it's all so different.
Yeah.
And when you're playing the full game, as you said earlier, you're not skating like the wind like these guys are today.
No, you're not. Yeah, and you're not being paid millions of dollars either.
There is that, yeah.
They were playing essentially because they loved the game. Their contracts were 1 page.
Mhm.
And if they accepted, they'd send Lester a telegram and say, accept contract.
Wow.
And many of them had other businesses. 2 guys ran a tobacco shop in Victoria. As I said, a lot of them were farmers. So they had other businesses. This was not their sole source of income.
Yeah, I mean, pre-war, pre the First World War, we were in an agriculture economy in
Exactly,
the country. Right?
yes.
So
Yeah,
I always like nicknames from different periods of time too. Newsy Lalonde is a name.
yeah.
It's known across Canada because he
Yeah.
played for but tell me about Newsy Lalonde being
Okay,
here.
well, he was big for Montreal.
Yeah.
And just, I don't know his whole story because I haven't researched Montreal, but they most of them had crazy names.
Mhm. Moose Johnson.
Oh,
Probably a
He-
big guy.
he was a big guy, and he was as tough as they come. And he actually played 1 game with his eye not quite in the socket.
Oh, Yeah, that wouldn't happen today.
No, oh Lord, no,
No.
they take him off for a hangnail. But no, he was. They would play injured, um, but they held Moose Johnson night, and that was they, gave him presents and to his wife, and then the game went 2 overtimes. They had to call it because the guys were exhausted.
Wow. You know what? Nobody would know any of these stories if you hadn't written this book.
No, and that's why I did it.
Yeah. And we're very grateful for that. We're also going to talk about a few other things that have happened here, including the winning of the Stanley Cup, which the Canucks haven't done yet, but Victoria, but I did. And it's true.
Yes.
Victoria did win the Cup. We're going to talk about that next. Our guest today is Helen Edwards, who has written this amazing book, The History of Professional Hockey in Victoria, in Greater Victoria, and I guess Oak Bay, because that's where...
Well, it was all Victoria in those days,
Yeah.
When it started.
But you and I are involved on a committee right now that's doing a celebration plan for the 100th anniversary of the Stanley Cup.
Yes.
Being won by the Victoria Cougars.
Exactly.
So they, correct me if I'm wrong here, they were the last non-NHL team to win the Cup. Is that right?
They were. They won it in 1925 on March 30th. They won it that year. The next year they played again and lost. And after, in 1927, it became the exclusive property of the NHL.
Okay. So when that was going on, the games were back and forth. They were playing Montreal.
Yeah.
That's who they were playing. But the Montreal home games weren't played in Montreal. They were played in Vancouver.
Well, they only played one game in Vancouver.
Mm-hmm.
How it usually worked was they just play all the games in one location. But because the Patricks, owned both teams, they figured they could get a good audience in Vancouver. So Game 3 of the series was played in Montreal in the Denman Street Arena, also burned down later, and was sold out, of course. And that's the one Montreal won.
There was a Stanley Cup won in BC 10 years before, like in 1915. Did the Vancouver Millionaires?
Vancouver Millionaires won the Stanley Cup.
Yeah. So, but they were in the Western League.
No,
right?
they were in the same. The leagues kept evolving.
Okay.
Because what would happen was they'd add Seattle, and then they'd add Portland, and then somebody'd drop out, and eventually the Victoria and Vancouver merged with teams from the prairies.
Yeah.
And Edmonton, Saskatoon, the Sheiks. What a name.
So something that I know is near and dear to your heart and that means a lot to you is that the Cougars left Victoria and their name went with them.
That's right.
What happened there?
Well,
Keep it polite.
okay, well, talking about the name itself, yes. We had a junior team called the Victoria Cougars, and they were pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
Guys going to the NHL, playing very well, Milt Bridgman, Rick LaPointe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then they were sold to Rick Brodsky, and he moved them to Prince George, and they're now the Prince George Cougars. And every time Prince George comes to play the Royals, I get annoyed.
But they sold the name with the team. Is that what happened? Or they just claimed it?
I don't know, because the professional team, after they won the Stanley Cup, another year played, then the NHL sort of had so much money. And the teams out west were largely family owned, much smaller, didn't have the big resources. So they were all sold to the NHL. So the Victoria Cougars became the Detroit Cougars, then the Falcons, now the Red Wings. But I don't know, because that name went there. I believe Lester Patrick still had the rights to the name Cougars because he had Cougars here in the 1950s. Now, how it got to the juniors, I don't know, because I haven't researched junior hockey. But it's just the fact that our name is gone.
And it's in Prince George.
And it's in Prince George.
And the evolution that I find fun is that, as you know, I'm a Detroit Red Wing fan. I grew up as a Gordie Howe fan and that stuff. So that evolution, taking the Cougars eventually to become the Detroit Red Wings.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the Patricks now. They went off to Manhattan. Lester Patrick and the rest of them, they went there and were involved in the evolution of the New York Rangers. Is
yes,
that right?
Lester Patrick was the general manager and coach at different times of the New York Rangers, and actually played goal in one game.
I was going to say, because his goalie got injured and he went in,
And
right?
he was 44 years old. He strapped on the pads and went in and played goal. Now, come on. Not many guys at 44 could play goal, period, let alone some guy that had been doing it virtually all his life.
Yeah, maybe Johnny Bauer.
Yeah, maybe. But, the legs give out, evidently. I don't know much about goaltending, but I don't imagine it, and at the NHL level, it's scary.
For sure. I want to go back a little bit. 1949 was a very pivotal year for hockey in Greater Victoria. Tell us why.
Well, because we had the Memorial Arena was built, finally, after all the politics, and they needed a team. And lo and behold, there was Lester Patrick with a new group called the Cougars.
Mm-hmm.
And he ran that for many years until he decided, okay, I'm just getting too old. Now, even though he owned the team here, he still worked in New York, but he maintained his house on Linden Avenue, just down from my house, and there's where he died. So he never forgot Victoria, where he had most of his success.
You referred earlier, too, to a team called the Victoria Maple Leafs that people who are maybe not that old or haven't lived here for a long time didn't know that there was a Maple Leaf team. Tell me about that.
Okay. That was the farm team of Toronto, and they had been in Denver as the Denver Invaders, and they just weren't drawing. So the Maple Leaf Brass moved them to Victoria, and we loved them. And their second year, they won a championship. And then after the third year, Toronto was in financial trouble, so they sold our team for $500,000 to people from Phoenix, and there went our team. But we do have to mention Bobby Barlow, who still lives in Victoria.
Yep.
Played for the Victoria Maple Leafs. And when he finally made it to the NHL with Minnesota, he scored at 6 seconds of his first shift in the NHL.
Yeah.
And
that's never been beaten. It's
never
been
beaten. And I believe the NHL will not acknowledge it.
Wow. Another name that sticks out that was kind of back and forth between Toronto and Victoria was Andy Hebbenton.
Yeah, well, he had played for the Cougars in the 50s.
Mm-hmm. All of these stories are in this book, The History of Professional Hockey in Victoria between 1911 and 2011. Where can we get a copy of this? Where can we buy one?
All the bookstores, Monroe's, Tanner's, Boland's, Ivy's. Russell's.
Okay. And we point out, too, that the proceeds from the sales of this book don't go to you. They go to
Connect Place Children's Hospice.
There you go. Helen, thank you for telling these stories. Thank you for being so generous with your time and your resources to support so much in town here. You'll see her at the Harbor Cats games, too, because she's one of the investors in that team as well. Helen Edwards, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And thank you for being a Chamber champion, Helen Edwards. I'm Bruce Williams. That's it. We'll see you for another Chamber Chat.